What's the most disturbing secret you've discovered about someone close to you? Story 1. Discovered that my sister stole my father's $25,000 Rolex not more than 24 hours after he passed. I only discovered it when her and her husband made a frivolous purchase, and I wondered where they got their money since they were always broke and begging my parents for money. I got suspicious. It hit me that she might have stolen and sold the Rolex, had the paperwork, ran a track on the sales history, and discovered it had been sold to a pawn shop down the street from where my sister lives. Went to the pawn shop and after a bit of persuasion, got them to tell me who sold it to them, and it was my sister. Me and my mom disowned her. Story 2. One night as a kid, I heard my parents having an explosive argument in their bedroom, which suddenly went quiet. The door was closed and locked. It was because she attempted to shoot my father in the face with a .303, but it didn't go off when she pulled the trigger as there were no bullets. They were both horrified and just stared at each other, apparently. They're still together. Story 3. Just found out the other day that it wasn't my neighbor's dad who senselessly shot and unalived my dog. It was his son, who I was close friends with. He did it on purpose. He knew how much that dog meant to me too. I also found out the other day where he lives. He's a meth head now, so I'll just let nature or the police do their thing. Story 4. My mom received birthday cards with money in them for years from her parents. She kept the cards with the money in them, saving to buy a piano/sentimental reasons. My sister, who is repeatedly stolen from family members, found a collection of cards/money and took them. My mom only wanted the cards back when she realized what happened. My sister denied everything. Story 5. I was pretty close with my youngest uncle growing up, at least in pictures. He was in his mid-20s when I was like 5 for context. One day when I was in middle school, he just stopped coming around completely. My entire family told us kids that he was backpacking around the nation. In high school, I was doing a genealogy project on my grandfather, his dad, and accidentally found my uncle's name on the sex offender registry. Come to find out, he was running a CP ring and had served 16 years in federal prison. He's out now, and my family pretends nothing happened. I stay far away. Story 6. Graduated boot camp and wondered why my brother wouldn't talk to me. Turns out he was doing the thing with my ex while I was there instead of delivering my letters. I guess guilt ate him up, and he thought it was simpler to keep up the lie and not to have a brother. Right up until an old friend from my hometown told me what happened. Story 7. My grandfather beat someone to the point of unaliving them. My dad was only a child, but my grandmother was once pregnant with my dad's younger brother. When she was 6 months pregnant, someone in construction equipment ran over the car she was driving and she lost the baby. While she was in the hospital, my grandfather found the guy and beat him to the point of unaliving them. From what I understand, he was in jail for about a week before he was released. Apparently, he claimed temporary insanity due to the circumstances. I learned all this about 4 years ago when my brother was researching family history and asked my grandfather about it. I've always seen him as a nice little old man. Story 8. Found out after his passing that my great uncle was a grand wizard in the KKK. Opened a chest in his attic with photos from rallies, lynchings, and cross burnings all around some rural part of Alabama. We were actually horrified by the discovery and suddenly realized why he was so negative towards his black hospice nurse, who was otherwise kind-hearted and caring with him and the family. Story 9. My brother was stealing money from my father who had dementia. This went on for a year, and then I found out about it because the bank who had my father's mortgage called me wondering why it hadn't been paid in 6 months. My father's bank account went into the negative around this time too, and when I confronted my brother about it, he said, "Well, I gotta pay my bills." I was about to take control of all the accounts and make sure crap got back on track, but my father ended up in the hospital and passed shortly after. My brother also stole some of my inheritance too. In the end, he stole over $5,000 from his passing father. Story 10. So my grandmother, who's been estranged from my family for a long time now for a multitude of reasons, has this weird thing where she has to share food with people. Are you ordering steak at the restaurant? Well, oh boy, she's gotta order the same thing, even if she doesn't like steak. Try her drink, it's really good. Take the first bite of chicken to let her know if it's any good. This always really annoyed me because I hate sharing food. One day I brought it up to my mom and she was like, oh yeah, grandma is afraid of being poisoned, so she wants other people to try it first. So let me get this straight. Grandma thinks someone is trying to poison her, so she has me try the food first? And it makes so much sense looking back because she literally would not take a bite out of anything she ordered until someone else had a bite first. Thanks, Grandma. Story 11. I found out that the reason why one of my uncles didn't want to go back to Korea when he retired was that he couldn't. He was fearful for political reprisals if he tried to return. Turned out his brother was part of the group that assassinated the South Korean president back in 1979, and his own innocence was never proven, so he was in fear of getting arrested if he ever tried to go back. Story 12. I said something in general about horses one time. My good friend just kinda shrugged and said, my uncle got messed up once by a horse. What the heck? Turns out my friend's uncle was the Mr. Hands guy from the Seattle area. My friend was like, oh yeah, there's a whole movie about it and everything. It's called Zoo. Some town called Enumclaw, Washington, is where this happened. I did look it up to see what he was talking about, since he just blindsided me with the whole story. I don't really know why someone would claim such a thing if it weren't true, but perhaps he just wanted to shock me. We don't really communicate anymore due to changing jobs. Story 13. A work colleague appeared on the front page of a national newspaper for a life of fraudulent qualifications. He claimed medical and law degrees, was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, and was the CEO of a major health fund. He actually was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, but that and the health fund role were largely built on the fraudulent qualifications and a progression of jobs also based on his claims. In reality, the only qualification he actually held was a mortuary assistant. Not even his wife knew. The fraudulent degrees had been gained when he was in the Army Reserves recruiting, and he had access to submitted position applications. He came undone when he applied for a government job, and some flags were raised by the recruitment people. He tried to withdraw the application, but didn't realize that an application for a government role has the same weight as a statutory declaration and cannot be withdrawn. It all went south very quickly, and he ended up doing jail time. Story 13. She was my best friend of 7 years. We had literally been through it all together. I moved out of state with my now husband, but she convinced us both to move back to be closer with her after about a year. We had no real ties to the state we had tried out, so we said screw it, let's go back, she's basically family. We were all so happy to be reunited. She was over almost every night for dinner. We all laughed and talked and had a blast. Best year of my life. Then, slowly, she started trying to turn my husband and I against each other. Anytime we had an argument, like any couple does, she would text each of us about how right we were, trying to foster animosity between the two of us. With me, she started talking about how she had a plan B for us, that if my husband and I couldn't make it work, I could move in with her and we would live happy lives together. With my husband, she started talking about her infertility issues and how she wanted to have a kid just like him. She just needed a sperm donor. This all happened around the same time, and my husband and I compared texts and figured it out. She wanted to take his sperm and have a baby with me. When confronted about it, she refused to admit anything and started lashing out at both of us. It got to the point where she would show up unannounced, banging on the door, demanding a place in our home. It was so terrifying and panic-inducing that we ended up having to move and change our phone numbers. I guess it's so disturbing because I never had a friend like her, only to find out that she cared about me, but in such an unhealthy and scary way. But yeah, that's my story. Husband and I are great now. Story 15. I wasn't close to this person, but I did hang out with them a few times. The best man at my wedding had another really close friend who turned out to be a serial killer. It messed him up really badly. He already had mental health issues, and this sent him over the edge. I can't even talk to him anymore. I miss you, man. Story 16. He shot his friend in the foot on purpose. They were teens and playing with a gun while drunk. Stupid, I know. And he accidentally shot his friend in the foot. Except it wasn't an accident. Story 17. The 24 hours before my dad passed, stage 4 lung cancer, he was in the ER and then the ICU, and we were unable to be with him because of hospital COVID rules. My mother, sister, and myself had been texting and calling him all day and got no response. My mother even called the hospital and spoke with one of his ICU nurses who said he was awake and communicating fine. He passed very quickly at 3:30 a.m. the next morning. We were allowed to be at his bedside, but by then he was no longer conscious, so we said our goodbyes and he was gone. Later that morning, while my mom slept, I was calling cremation services to schedule his body for pickup at the hospital, and going through his bag of belongings the hospital had returned to us. His phone was in there, and I wanted to read all of our texts and take some comfort in my last words to him. I opened his phone and all our texts had not been read, not mine or my mom and sister's. I thought this was so odd, but figured he must have been suffering so much he couldn't find the strength. I began to scroll through his apps and noticed a chat app I'd vaguely heard of. I can't recall the name, but it essentially works like WhatsApp. I opened the app and saw a single contact with a female name. I started reading and realized my dad has been chatting with this girl hourly for the last 24 hours, and as far back as I could scroll. He was calling her princess and telling her he loved her, and she was saying she was scared for him and wanted to know what was going on, why he was in the ER, etc. I scrolled back enough to know that this was someone he was having at the very least an emotional affair with. My grief was completely hijacked by hurt and anger, and a week later, I tracked the girl down and spoke to her via DMs, and found out she was 19 years old. She was 17 when they met. He was her high school bus driver, and she told me they'd been dating for almost 2 years. My dad was 66 years old when he passed, and dating someone younger than his grandchildren, someone he chose to spend his last moments with and say his last goodbyes to. I hope it made him happy, but it sure is a crappy secret to live the rest of my life with. A secret that will forever overshadow my entire relationship with my dad, with no chance to ever speak to him about it. It's the one secret I wish I'd never found out. Story 18. I don't know how disturbing this is. It turned out pretty fantastic for one, but not for another. I was adopted and told a silly magical story about my birth parents that most certainly did not seem true even when I was a child. At 57, I learned I was the result of a college affair between a very seriously Jewish young man and a very Baptist young woman. She was rushed off to a home for wayward girls to give birth. He followed her there, many states away, begging her to keep me and live a life together. But their families both said absolutely not. Jewish people were not viewed as white in the mid-60s, and her family most certainly did not want her marrying a non-white. Plus, she was a very committed Christian and did not want to convert to Judaism. So off I went into another family. I recently discovered 3 lovely half-siblings, and we're all pro or semi-pro musicians and get along well. I never got to meet my mother. She passed away a year before I searched. My father is out of the picture and wants to be left alone. And I'm fine with that. I'm grateful for the love he gave me. It was enough. Another person that was in my non-bio family was also adopted. She was older than me. She tracked down her mom later in life too. She was in a hospital and had been since the day she was born. She was born holistically disabled, physical, mental, cognitive, learning, sensory, and was essayed by an orderly, and she discovered she was the result. Endings to our searching are not always happy. Story 19. When I was young, I had vague ideas about my uncle being dodgy. In that, at family events such as weddings, etc., my parents would tell me and some of my cousins to stay away from him. When I was in year 8, we were doing a lesson in citizenship class where we had to cut out pieces from a newspaper, no idea why. And I came across an article saying he'd been recommitted to a Broadmoor prison. Went home and googled him and found out he'd been in prison in the 80s for kidnapping and essaying someone. and had been in and out of prison since for other offenses. He also tried to sue the Sun once for defamation since they printed something incorrect about him. He was awarded 1 penny by the court because it technically was defamation, but it was agreed that what they had printed couldn't have damaged his reputation any further. All I know is that he was in a halfway house for a long time. However, from what I've gathered, he was released around 5 years ago. Story 20. My grandfather is a ghost on paper. We always grew up knowing he had skeletons in his closet, but I wasn't prepared for what he had done in his younger years. I started hearing rumors as a teen that he had been a pretty big time robber. His specialty was cracking the safes, but he would never admit it. In 2016, he randomly told me he also used to deal guns to the IRA, like he was talking about the weather. It was bizarre. He also told me he helped a couple of triads hide out in Jamaica after they went on the run for unaliving an adversary. They were fairly nice guys, according to him. It was only about 10 years ago he finally stopped sleeping with guns stashed under his bed and taking shady phone calls down the bottom of the garden. Only my grandmother knows his real name and no one else in the family does. I adore him, but he's an enigma to me. Story 21. My extended family on my mom's side has a strange practice of turning horrific family events into funny stories to tell at family gatherings and the like. I believe mostly as a way to deal with the trauma. The time my grandfather tried to shoot my grandmother in their living room with the kids present, or when my mom got beat for saying Billy D. Williams was hot, were among those stories, both of which were told at Christmas parties, even when I was very young. The only stuff that doesn't get turned into fun stories is the stuff that no one knows how to process and just wants to bury. And that stuff I've only gotten tiny glimpses at, probably for the best. The one that stands out is when my grandmother let slide that my grandfather was in the KKK, participated in lynchings, and was really proud of how good he was at it. Or when I found later in life that the only reason I saw him growing up when none of my cousins did was that he knew where my mom lived but not his other kids, and that us not visiting wasn't an option. Which did make sense considering his house and everything that happened in it was, in retrospect, weird as all heck. Like hanging out with the mute grandkids of his new wife as they played with dead rats in Barbie clothes in a dollhouse made of reclaimed driftwood levels of weird. Those were definitely bizarre stories, but thank you so much for watching. If you have stories of your own, please feel free to write them below in the comments so I can make a video on them in the future. Like the video and subscribe to the channel if you liked it. I'll see you in the next one.